Morning, Ag Power class. A brief screencast today. When I was going through tire changing, I thought it would probably be best if we talked about safe tire changing procedures. There's a lot of mistakes that are made that can have detrimental effects if that you're not extremely careful, especially if you're changing a tire on the roadside. So I want to make sure that we're all aware of those things. What I would like you to do today is go to the worksheet, answer the flashback. As I go through these notes, I've got just an outline of some guided notes I want you to take. Share those with me. That way I know that you've got them. I've also made an outline for you just in case you want to file this away. It talks about some things that you can do when changing a tire, and it goes step by step by step. So if you're ever in that situation, you've got it. But so if we take a look at changing a tire, step number one is going to be move that vehicle or piece of equipment to a safe location. This is most imperative when we talk about being on the roadside, but conditions can vary so much. In this right-hand picture, we've got interstate travel. This is California, lots of cars whizzing by, and there's some serious implications of trying to change a tire when traffic is that heavy, people not paying attention, people swerving, you being too close to the roadside when you're on the shoulder. So you definitely want to get that vehicle into a safe location. Other implications could be weather, flat tire, middle of a storm, especially snow. It very much limits visibility. When we talk about farm equipment, tires can happen in the mud. Mud is not going to be a suitable surface to put jacks under a tractor or a hay wagon or whatever implement it is and try and jack it up. What we'll want to do is spread out that surface area some way. You can utilize, if that you're worried about damaging that tire, you need to save that tire. You don't want to. So back up a minute. If that we get a flat tire and we see it is visibly flat, if we continue to move that implement, that wagon, especially with a load in place, we can cause damage to that tire. It can shred. So what we want to do in some instances is just try and lift that piece of equipment or that tractor up. And in some situations that's dangerous because what that tractor or what that implement's on is a soft surface like mud, especially this time of year. So what we'll want to do is build up the surface area that piece of equipment's on. We can use layers of wood. Sometimes if it's uneven, you might have to take some sort of garden tool like a hoe or a shovel, smooth that surface out, and then lay your wood down. A good base piece of wood to use is plywood. Plywood's really going to spread out the surface area. You don't need a full sheet. A full sheet would be fine. It might be hard to get underneath that piece of equipment, but just a square that's 2 by 2 or 3 by 3 feet is going to allow the spreading out of that surface area. Then we can begin the stacking process of 2 by 4s or 2 by 6s, just back and forth crisscrossed. We can use bigger dimension lumber like 6 by 6s or 4 by 4s, just enough to get our jack up underneath that piece of equipment. Now, I didn't go into jack types in this particular slideshow. The most common that we will see on the farm today is going to be this tool called a bottle jack. A bottle jack has an oscillating pedestal, and as you pump, it's going to send different pedestals out in order to pick up that piece of equipment. They are great for getting into tight spaces. The downside to a bottle jack is that top dowel of that pedestal is very, very small in diameter. So you're putting a lot of weight on this very small diameter. And if for whatever reason that jack shifts, the whole thing could shift off. So you have to be extremely careful when using a bottle jack. Again, they're going to be the easiest one to get in there. Now, the most common jack that we think of is probably a hydraulic pump jack, and those are great. The problem is they're on wheels, and what they're supposed to do on wheels, one is be able to slide under that implement easily, which is great if you're in the shop, but flat tires don't always happen in the shop. So if we're in the mud and we're on that plywood, we're going to have to be extremely careful if that's the only jack we have, because those wheels are also made to compensate as you're jacking up that implement. So you're lifting that load, it is actually going to roll some. The downside to that is if you've got this plywood laid out and you start jacking up your implement and it starts to roll, you could roll off of the plywood pretty easily. So you've got to be careful using a hydraulic hand pump jack. The other type of jack, and the one that your parents, your grandparents might reach for, one you might see on the farm, is this thing called a handyman jack. And it clicks. It's got a series of notches in the jack. I'll go through and I'll show you all these real quick. But we'll start with the handyman jack. They're also called a high lift jack. They were the jack of choice back in the day. The problem is you need a pretty secure surface in order to lift. Again, you've got this small base that the jack sits on, so you'll have to have some sort of built up board system in order for that jack to not sink right down into the soil. But as you lift this handle up, it just goes notch by notch by notch into this jack. The downside to these is it's hard to get a straight lift using this jack. A lot of times they want to tilt. We don't see a lot of these used today on vehicles just because there's no real place where we have a nice firm angle to lift vehicles up with. You can use them on tractor axles. A lot of tractor axles today are rounded, so there's not a good straight lift spot on them anyway. So they've almost become obsolete. Jeep guys that have off-road vehicles, those of you with pickup trucks that have off-road bumpers where you can set that foot underneath and then just lift, they can be suitable there, but they're not going to be the easiest. If we look at a hydraulic floor jack that's rolling, if I could spell, again, they're on wheels, and as you lift this pedestal, what's going to happen is it's going to roll to compensate. So you have to be careful. The last one, and the one that I prefer the most, is just a hydraulic bottle jack. And as I said, you actually have a pedestal. A lot of people don't know this, but this pedestal will thread in and out. So you can actually get some extra reach there. And all of these jacks are weighted. If you're looking at these pictures, you're like, what's that? Well, this actually has a pneumatic hydraulic pump on it. So if that you have an air compressor, you can hook the air compressor up, push, and it's going to do the lifting for you instead of cranking with the handle. Again, you have to be on a solid surface if that's what you're going to utilize for your jacking purposes. Big differences here. When you're on the interstate, there is a shoulder, but if you were in this far left lane, you're going to have to limp over to the right lane and try and do your tire change. Extremely dangerous. Now, in this picture on the right, not as much of a concern. Doesn't look like there's much traffic. You've got a very solid, clear shoulder that you can pull off and do your tire change. Sometimes even on the farm, you're knee deep in cow manure and you can put all the boards that you want down, but those boards are just going to keep sinking. You may have to roll that piece of equipment. You may have to get that vehicle to a safer area, and it may mean damaging that tire completely or damaging the rim. So what's happened here is we had a flat tire. The individual did not feel like they were in a safe place to change that tire, so they kept driving, which is good advice. In the event of driving, though, they've shredded the sidewall of the tire, and you can see here there's actually some damage to the rim, and that's going to happen. This is a much better scenario than getting out there on the shoulder of the interstate and trying to change a tire where there are cars whizzing by. this is a much better scenario than trying to change a tire in very soft cow manure where this implement's kind of just teeter-tottering back and forth the entire time. Okay. We could say, oh, I can handle it. I can get that wheel off of that wagon full of hay and then put the wheel back on. And maybe you can, but if that wagon slips off the jack, you could have a load of hay that falls on you. At the very best, you're going to have to now try and figure out how the heck are we going to jack up this whole wagon full of hay if we've got a flat tire. So, and it's buried in the ground. So sometimes it's not worth it, guys. Be safe. Use your head. Okay. This rim probably costs $200 to replace. The tire is destroyed. That's probably going to be $150 or $200. You might be able to find a used tire that's suitable. That is much, much better than a hospital bill or than your life. I promise you. Here's other situations. We've got, I'm going to move this silly box here. So we've got an exit ramp. Exit ramps actually provide a pretty good location if you can limp down the road if you are doing interstate travel. Here where the cursor is, we've got this wedge shape. Again, you still have vehicles passing by, but that's going to give you lots and lots of room to work. And theoretically, there should not be very many people getting close to that area at all. So you give yourself that much more room. If you're close to an exit, you could look for that wedge shape part of the median. Another thing that you could do is just pull off to the shoulder on the exit ramp and hope people are paying attention. And I've elected to change many tires myself on the shoulder of an exit ramp versus on the shoulder of the highway. This is a bridge that crosses a lake and you've got these concrete Jersey barriers on both sides. There is no shoulder. So your only option is either stop and hold up traffic or keep driving. One thing to caution you, if you do choose to drive, you are going to go ahead and shred that tire just to get to a safe place, which again is the better option. Go slow. Tires that do not have air in them heat up because of the movement, and they could actually, that tread can come loose, and if you're spinning too fast, it can hit the fender well or the bumper of the car, and it can cause more damage. So go slow. When I say slow, I'm talking about 10 to 15 miles an hour max. It should probably be slower than that. Okay, but put your flashers, your hazard lights on, and just proceed forward. The next thing you want to do is make sure that that vehicle or that piece of farm equipment is on level ground. So on our farm, when we square bale hay, we drop all the bales, and then we go back through and we pick them up with a bumper pull trailer. And one time we had a load of hay on this bumper pull trailer and got flat. And it was just a single axle bumper pull trailer, and we were on a pretty steep hillside. So instead of just shutting her down and trying to change that tire on the hillside, we damaged the tire just to get it to level ground in order to change it. So that is something to be aware of. Make sure that vehicle is on level ground, that piece of farm equipment. All right. The next thing, we want to limit movement as much as possible. If that we are changing the tire on an implement, the transmission, the final drive of the tractor, should lock that piece of equipment in place and keep it from moving forward or backward. Now, that's not always true in mud. Sometimes the drawbar on a tractor has a lot of play. That hole is worn out. Sometimes the drawbar actually has some give itself. And then sometimes in mud, you can just see some unexpected movement. So you want to make sure that you're chalking the tires around the vehicle. If that you are changing the tires on the trailer, you want to chalk one of the axles. Trailer axles are weighted using this thing called a shackle. And I'll show you. There can actually be a lot of movement if that you are not aware of how you're jacking up that tire. You can even jack the whole thing up and not get anywhere. So if you look in between tires of a lot of trailers, they have this thing called a shackle system. And as you jack up that axle, it may load the other axle and cause the trailer to move. So if you are out and about and you get a flat tire, you've got to be careful about where you are jacking up that particular axle. So here's a good example. What's happened is they've jacked up this axle and it's moved this one. And if you had this wheel chalked, it might pull it away from your block. So you've just got to be aware of that. Always be paying attention, especially if your trailer's got a load on it. And that seems to be when the majority of these flats happen, is when you've got that trailer loaded. All right. Now, the next thing to do before we jack the vehicle, the piece of farm equipment up, is we want to loosen the lug nuts. Unless we've got a high-powered air impact or a high-powered electric impact, loosen those lug nuts, then what's going to happen? We do so because we've got weight on that tire that's putting pressure on it. If we are hand loosening those lug nuts and our spindle and our bearing is in good shape, what's going to happen is we're just going to spin that wheel. So we kind of see that on the wheel bearing with the wagon. Once Clay Christopher's trailer was in the air, those tires are going to spin. So we want to make sure that that wheel's got some weight on it. We can loosen those lug nuts. If not, if we have an air-powered impact, it'll zip them off in the air, but it's best to just try and zip them off, loosen them up before we put that vehicle or that piece of farm equipment, that trailer, in the air. We do not want to take those lug nuts all the way off. If you do that before you jack it up, then the wheel is just going to fall off and it can become a hazard for your safety. Once the lug nuts are loosened, then we're going to lift that trailer up or that farm implement up. And we want to utilize this tool called a jack stand to securely hold that implement, that trailer. Now, I understand if we're on the roadside, we're probably not going to have a jack stand handy. If you're wondering what a jack stand is, thinking back to shop class, this is what those wagons are on. But they are devised based on, I don't know why it says jack stand, based on their capacity. So 3 ton is pretty standard. They make 10 ton, they make 20 ton. And you're like 15-ton jack stands. These are the ones they use for semis. They're massive. But anyway, again, if you have a breakdown on the side of the interstate, you're probably not going to have a jack stand just in the back of your truck. So we've got to come up with a plan. If you're on the farm and you're in mud anyway, it might be a bad idea to try and put a jack stand under that, or try and devise a way to put a jack stand underneath that wagon or that mixer or whatever it is that you're pulling. So you might want to utilize something else. What I tell people when they are working on the roadside of a car is it's really handy to utilize the tire that they are taking off or the spare tire that they have for the vehicle. And in the event that there is a slip with the jack or something happens, at least that car is not going to land on the ground. Now, again, you have to be careful. So if we've taken our spare out of the trunk or out from underneath the frame of the truck that we're driving, or the spare off of the trailer, we can put it underneath that trailer, or we can put it underneath the frame of the vehicle, take the tire off that's flat, and then swap it out and then put the new tire on. But you got to be careful, okay? Vehicles are unpredictable, especially when they're on a little pedestal of a jack. So just be aware. You always got to be on your game when you're doing a tire change, especially on a roadside. Now, if we're on the farm, we're in mud, the best thing that I can think of to serve as a jack stand is just good old big dimension blocks of wood. So you might have some railroad tie pieces, some 6x6s, some 6x6s and 4x4s. If you have nothing else, you could just use 2x4s and crisscross them, cut them into 2-foot chunks and crisscross them. Those make great stands for implements. Again, we are just putting those there in the event that the jack fails. We do not want to be pinned or have all of our eggs hoping that this jack is going to be the fix-all. Next thing we're going to do, we've got the wheel off. We're going to line up the studs with the holes in the wheel itself, and then we're going to put it on the hub, and then we're going to start tightening those lug nuts. Now, once the lug nuts are tight, and I don't mean tightened all the way, but pretty tight, snug enough to hold that wheel in place, we'll then want to drop that wheel back down to the ground, applying pressure to it, and then start torquing or tightening those lug nuts as much as possible. Word of caution here, do not over tighten the lug nuts. If you do, they will simply just break off the studs. These studs are not made of hardened steel. They're actually designed to break. That way, if you over tighten them, you're not going to stretch the threads. A big mistake that people make, especially on small cars, is using that air impact to zip those lug nuts down and tighten them all the way. Again, they are not made of high tensile steel. So you're just going to tighten, and all of a sudden they're going to snap. And if you use an impact enough on those lug nuts, they will actually elongate and they'll just shear off, like has happened in this particular picture here. If you are working on a hay wagon or a trailer, or if you're working on the rear end of a front wheel drive car, you can actually hold that wrench in place, that lug wrench, or if you're lucky enough in the event of a flat tire to have a breaker bar or a ratchet, but you can hold that ratchet and then you can spin the wheel and it will very quickly tighten up those lug nuts. And hopefully when school resumes, we'll go over this procedure in class. Guys, that's it. Answer the flashback. Go ahead and send me those guided notes, and then tomorrow we'll talk about changing tires, how that's done, and some different inflation methods, and then we'll have it wrapped up. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.